Hello everyone. I'm going to do my second video for this, artists or music to recommend. I'm going to do another one of my favorite bands ever, a little less known than XTC. Um, I'm going to do one on the Jesus and Mary chain. Yes, I know it's a very odd title. Um, Apparently, the name of the band comes from an ad they saw for a Bible in some magazine somewhere, where it said, "And if you buy today, you get an extra Jesus and Mary chain necklace with your order," or something to that extent. Uh, what do I know? They seem to think it was a neat title. Um, the band was formed by William and Jim Reid from Scotland, and they employed bassist Douglas Hart uh, for their first couple of records, and um, had a drummer with them at certain points, which always seemed to fluctuate during the band. In 1984, they got signed to Creation Records, later home to bands such as Oasis and House of Love, and Ride, and Teenage Fan Club, and many other bands of that ilk, and released the single Upside Down, which was immediately picked up by the press and was sort of the flavor of the week kind of thing over in England. Um, the the record um, came out and put Creation Records on the map, but soon afterwards they went to another record label, and where they stayed for the next 5 albums, or at least the next decade. 1985 saw them release their first album, Psycho Candy, my favorite album titles. Is generally considered one of the best debut albums of the 80s, let alone of all time. At this point in the band's career, they were known for their very short and very loud, abrasive live shows where they used feedback as part of the sonic kind of scope of what they were doing. It does take a minute to get used to, but once you listen through that, you realize that they were writing very well crafted, very catchy pop songs. This has the, the popular "Just Like Honey," which has been featured in several movies and TV shows and stuff, including Lost in Translation. I believe it's the end credits, the end scene of the movie. I believe I haven't seen it, but and they became known as one of the most, basically the next Sex Pistols at the time, including a famous incident where there was a riot at one of their shows because of certain technical problems and things, and you know. So 1985, they released this. 1986 was they came out with an EP of a song called "Some Candy Talking." Apparently, the song was banned from the radio because apparently they believed candy was apparently a slang term at the time for drugs. I believe heroin. I'm not entirely sure. And so the song was banned from the radio, even though you listen to the lyrics, it's clearly not about drugs. And then, so by the time 1987 came along, they released Darklands, their second album, which basically stripped back the feedback from the record. And this record was made entirely by the two brothers. They played all the instruments on it and had their biggest hit single which was April Skies, which was a top 10 hit over in England. Um, they it's a gorgeous record with a couple more ballads. William, the guitarist, sings lead on a couple of songs on this, which the two brothers wrote everything in the band, but William tended to be the one who wrote more. But Jim was the better was the one who sang more often because he generally had was more the front man. This one, though, William sings 3 of the 10 songs on the record, which ends up kind of later down the road becomes important that he started doing this. 1988, they release the single Sidewalking, which featured the previous album Darklands had featured drum machines, but this record was now including sequencing. Sidewalking included sequencing and bass and things of that nature, and was sort of influenced by the sound that was coming out of hip hop and things in that realm at the time. And then 1989 is Automatic, which didn't get as much attention at the time. It was kind of critically derided at the time because a lot of the songs used the same 3 chords and such, which they've talked about in interviews, sort of, well, what's wrong with 3 chords? This record has some of their best songs on it. Between Planets is one of my favorites. Blues from a Gun, and Head On. Head On was later covered by the Pixies. So some of you are Pixies fans, you'll know that version from their last album. And was again just featuring the 2 members, the 2 brothers. It was around this time, I believe, that the bassist left, Douglas Hart, who played with them live but wasn't playing on records anymore. So they went their separate ways. I think he ended up joining another band. I don't remember which one off the top of my head. But 1990, they release the Roller Coaster EP, which featured the single of the same name, which also featured a cover of Tower of Song from Leonard Cohen. 1991, the band spent their time building their own studio called the Drugstore, and spent that time building it, and once they were done, recording their next album, which is Honey's Dead. Honey's Dead coming out in 1992, it featured a lot of sounds and effects that were becoming normalcies in the business because of the inclusion of grunge and house music, baggy kind of scene, Manchester scene happening at the time. The single Reverence, which was the first track on the record, had certain references to religious figures and certain political figures, which people didn't take very kindly, and was banned from certain radio stations. Also had the video for Teenage Lust, the second song on the record, was banned because it featured some nudity in it. The next record, they took a very different approach. They kept with their next EP was The Sound of Speed, which was a little more kind of blues rock kind of based, and was just the 4 tracks. But for their next record, they initially wanted to make an acoustic record, which they had pointed out that they were interested in doing over their previous records. They famously recorded a acoustic session not long after Psycho Candy, their first album, which made a big stink at the time of sort of this band that's famous for feedback. Doing acoustic sessions seemed unheard of, and yet it's an amazing session. I have it in this set. The record ended up being a little more of a mix. It's a little more laid back, a little more country flavorings on it. It's acoustic based, but does have electric instruments and things on it, but is much more mellow and understated out of their catalog. The album is Stoned and Dethroned. This record has their biggest hit here in America, which is Sometimes Always, which featured Hope Sandoval, the band Maisie Starr, who was dating William, the guitarist. And another song, God Help Me, which featured the Pogues, Shane MacGowan on lead vocals, which is one of the better songs in the album. This record, which is their second to last of their original time, was the first to feature the band, the songs being credited to each of the writers, Jim and William. The reasoning for that was the two of them were starting to have infighting, were starting to not get along very well, and which led to the creation of their last record. After Stoned and Dethroned, they lost their record label. They lost their deal and went back to creation for their final record, Monkey, in 1998. By this point, the two of them were not speaking at all and famously broke up on the tour during the tour to promote this album. This was originally a double album, 17 songs on the record, predated by the single "I Hate Rock and Roll," which came out in, I believe, 96 or 97. This was 98. It took them nearly 2 years to put this record together because the two of them were fighting so badly. They essentially recorded with mostly the same musicians, completely separate from each other. So, but despite the point that you have the two writers in the band basically playing without the other on the record, it's actually very coherent record. It is sonically fits very well with each other. Has the big hits, the big singles off of it, where I Love Rock and Roll and Cracking Up, and of course I Hate Rock and Roll, which I mentioned. The band broke up during this tour in 98, 99 time period. They went off and did their various side projects, none of which did that amazingly at the time. In the year 2007, they got back together and did a song. I believe they went out on the road and started touring again. Two of them being brothers, it was bound to happen eventually. 2008, they featured a song called "All Things Must Pass" on the soundtrack to Heroes, the TV series. And it wasn't until 2017 that they released "Damage and Joy," their first album in nearly 20 years. I really liked this record. I thought this record stands up next to their back catalog. Had "All Things Must Pass," a different version of it on there, and a couple of other singles, one of which I believe it was "The Two of Us" featured. Can't remember the woman's name. Indie personality person on it. I can't remember her name. Is featured on one of the songs. There's a video of them playing it on, I think, Kimmel or something like that. Very good band. They have a unique sound. They became an inspiration on a lot of the guitar bands through the 80s, alternative rock scene. And there's great pop tunes in it. So I think is a great place to look. Great underrated band. I will see you all next week.